All right, welcome back to the next of these exciting tutorials. We're taking a look at how to create this science fiction landscape using nothing but procedural effects, modifiers, and textures, all generated inside Blender 2.8. Now, what we're going to start doing is positioning all of our objects in the scene. And to do that, we're going to switch back to our normal solid view, and we're going to get rid of our shader view for the moment. So just click down here, we get the little cross symbol and release, and that'll disappear. I'm going to hit the 0 key on my number pad to jump back into my camera, and I'm going to just start positioning these guys. Okay. Now I'm going to use one of them for a floor. So let's grab this one, and remember to grab end and start as well, and hit Shift D. I'll turn my widgets all back on as well. And okay, for our floor, I'm going to get rid of the simple deform because I don't want it to be bending. And let's move these the nulls around just to see what we can get. All right, let's go ahead and scale it up. So I'm going to hit S, Shift Z, and that's going to scale it up on every axis except for the Z axis. So if you want to exclude an axis, if you want to exclude an axis, then hit Shift and then the letter that corresponds to it. I'll scale it up a little bit on the Z now. All right, move it down. See, it's just jumping all over the place. And that's going to create some really cool land for us. And really what we can do is, let's have a look at what happens when we can create interesting landmass features with this. I might bring it up a touch and grab our other null and just see what happens when we move it around. Now you can animate all of these effects, and that, of course, can give you some really cool looks. It's kind of nice on the other side. We get this like bowl effect. I'll try that. Let's rotate it on the X by 180. Bring it up so it's intersecting our spires, and it's probably a bit too big, so just figure out which one's causing it. There we go. Just bring it down a little bit. All right, let's see how that's working for us. I'll hit rendered, and I'm going to brighten up our world just so we can kind of see it a little bit better while we're building things. So I'm just going to bring that right up. And oh, cool. It's going to give us some nice, interesting kind of patterns. It may not be dense enough for what we need it to be. Okay, I'm going to scale this down and see what happens. And let's grab our nulls and let's move them around. It's a bit hard to see what's happening. Let's switch back to solid. What does that do for us? Okay, so it's going to create some interesting kind of shelf look. Just thinking maybe I could create an opening for our camera. Like if we go like this, and then bring it down so that our objects are in the scene. Really, we could find a good, a really nice shape first, and then move our objects to fit that shape. It may be a better idea. Scale it down. We can use multiple of these as well to really create the look. How's that? That's pretty cool. All right, what happens if we make another one? So rock spire, rock end, rock start, Shift D, grab on the x-axis. Actually, let's grab this one on the y-axis, and I'm gonna scale this one right up and bring it back on the y and bring it up. And let's affect the modifiers a little bit for us. Might let this one be a bit more of like a normal shape. Bring it down. Now we get these intersections. It should still work well for us. All right, let's see what this looks like. It's a bit rough with the texture. We need to change the size of the texture on this object, but overall, it's not a bad start. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to keep playing with it. I'm going to just change the shape of objects. I'm going to move things around and just fiddle with the scene until I get something that I think really looks cool. So I'm just going to fast forward this a little bit so you can watch it in fast motion. If anything comes up where I decide to make a change or find something that can really make it look cooler, I'll stop and talk a bit about that from there. Okay, so yeah, hold on to your seatbelts, switching to fast forward mode now. So I decided that it'd be a good idea to kind of talk through some ideas while we do this fast forward section. I think it's really helpful to consider when you're trying to lay out a scene like this, you want to be thinking about your overall composition. And you also want to be thinking about your overall believability of the scene. So like how realistic is it looking? How much is it making sense visually? And so what I'm doing right now, I mean, basically it's just selecting the different objects, making sure I've got the two empties selected as well, duplicating them and then moving them around. I'm playing with the scale of the two empties as well to try and change the overall look. And I'm scaling up the entire object. So each rock spire, I'm scaling them up, scaling them down to create different looks. And I'm kind of taking it in visually. So I keep jumping back to my camera. And that's to, keep looking at the scene from the perspective of my camera. And that's really important because you can start laying out a scene, looking from another perspective, and you may not be actually you might end up spending a lot of detail and a lot of time in an area that your camera's never actually going to see. So it's really important to kind of work out your shot and work out how your camera's going to move beforehand. And that's really, really helpful. So that's what I'm doing here. So that's why I keep jumping back into this view. And now I'm just trying to frame the shot. So I've got the plan of, like in the example that I've created before, of having this spherical object, egg-shaped object in the center as the focal point. And all these rock spires are going to be kind of pointing towards it to create this nice kind of interesting composition. But I also want to make sure it doesn't look too uniform and it looks really organic and natural. So that's why you can see, I kind of started out with those two rows of spires, and now I'm backing them off and I'm trying to create more variation amongst them, and I'm trying to block other sections, and just continually thinking about the overall appearance and how it's looking. I really, to be honest, don't know, what the result's going to be. Like sometimes you're sitting there and you're playing with this stuff and you're thinking, this may not look good at all, and sometimes it doesn't. And you switch to a rendered view like this and you go, hey, wow, that looks really great, and it's kind of a happy accident. You set up the pieces in place, and you trust that when working all together, all the pieces will kind of make a really nice cohesive whole. Sometimes it doesn't, and that's when you have to go back to your shaders or your materials, or go back to your models and your plan for the scene and try and rework it. Now this, of course, is the second time I'm making the scene, because I made the original and as an example to kind of set the course for myself in putting these tutorials together. And so the second time around, I'm actually finding new discoveries, and I'm actually improving on it. And that's something you'll find as well, that if you make something twice, the second time around, you probably end up with a much better result because you're familiar with the process, and gives you the opportunity to really iterate and make something a little bit better. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So if a scene's not really working, sometimes it's great just to delete everything and start fresh. You'd be surprised how quickly you can get back to a similar place compared to how it took you the first time. And I was trying to remember that. So you can end up spending a lot more time, wasting a lot more time, actually trying to make a scene that's not working work, as opposed to starting fresh with what you've learned in the process and recreating things and trying to improve on the build. And you can end up with something a whole lot better. So you can see here now the versatility of our rock objects. The fact that we can use them to create, really large set pieces, then also these tiny rocks like that tiny one that I just created and put in the foreground. And that's the beauty of this kind of procedural approach is, as we're moving the object through space, we are getting a lot of different perspectives on the object. It's changing its shape, its overall form, and it's just working really well for us. And so here you can see I've moved one right out to the back now, and I'm playing around with the overall scale just to create, huge landmass in the distance. And you can see even just from this view that it's actually really effective. Like it's a pretty good landscape. Like it sells itself quite well. There's enough variation. There's enough kind of unique profiles to the objects that you look at this, you'd never be able to tell that this was all coming from, in essence, just a bunch of cubes, all with the same modifiers, using the same texture to derive their shape. So that's pretty cool. And that's, again, the power of this stuff. It helps you move much faster. You can see I'm moving back and forth between using cycles to visualize and using Eevee to visualize. And that's to just kind of continue to give me a better sense of what the final scene's actually looking like. And I have a really specific idea in my head of wanting to create this really framed center section. But I remember at this point, I began to think maybe I didn't need that as much. And I started thinking a bit more about irregularity and maybe not having a perfectly symmetrical scene. So I was liking having this giant landmass in the background that was kind of cutting through the scene a little bit. But I am thinking about balance as well. And so I'm trying to now move these spires on the right to kind of fill in that negative space that's been created in the distance. And you can see there I finally decided, okay, it's probably better to back off that shape and move it out of the way a little bit so that the overall composition feels a bit more balanced. You don't want to have a lopsided scene, where there's a bunch of big things on the left and there's a bunch of tiny things on the right, and it feels really out of balance. So I'm just trying to equally fill my space so that artistically it feels like a good composition. Okay, so I'm done with kind of laying out the scene. We're going to have a little bit more. I'm going to add in another object that's going to go in this background here that's going to create sort of like our far distance plane. But overall, I think it's looking pretty good. There's a few, kind of things that are popping up as we begin to fill the scene with these objects where all of our, randomly generated stuff is kind of showing some of its seams. So like on the ground, these large objects, when they have the large patches, it doesn't quite work. Let me turn down my... to 20, there we go. So it's breaking down a little bit. We can see, just with the red patches that are beginning to fall apart, it's just looking a little too big. And we're getting a lot of smooth shine on our ground objects, so we need to affect those a little differently than everything else. But overall, we've laid out the scene and we've refined our texture. It's looking really good. So our next step is we're going to take our ground texture and we're going to affect it differently from our spires. And we're also going to organize our scene a little bit. And once we get those two things done, I think we're going to wrap it up with this tutorial. So let's take a quick look at our scene. I'm going to just collapse down everything. One helpful tip, when you're moving things around and you're trying to find stuff, if you have something selected in the scene, so let's say I've selected, this, and it's in my overview, I can't see it. When you're in your view, if you hit the full stop or the period key on your number pad on the keyboard, it'll zoom in and you focus on that object. Well, that happens anywhere. So if we hover over our outliner and we hit the full stop or period key on our number pad, it's going to take us straight to whatever we have selected. So if I select something else, period, again, it takes me right to it. So that's a great way to kind of find things when you've got a ton of stuff in your scene. So I'm going to collapse these all down so that we can have a look at organizing our project a little bit better. And we're going to create a new collection. Now, collections are ways of organizing your scene. I'm going to create a new collection, and we're just going to rename this rock, and leave it at that. And let's select everything. So we'll select all of our rock spires, and I'll just hit the B key to get the box select tool up. We'll drag all of these into, okay, so this is a good thing to point out. So I've just dragged everything into this, right? But all of our nulls are still up here. Now, this can be frightening at first because you think, oh no, it's separated my nulls from my objects and now it's a mess and I can't get everything relinked. But that's not actually what's happened. It's just organized these things and showing them in a way where everything in this collection is appearing here, everything in this collection is appearing here. But you can see that they're still affecting the rock spire and they're still parented to the rock spires. It's just they're grayed out, which means they're organized in another collection. So this is just a really handy way. You can actually organize things that are nested into each other in different collections and stuff. So that's a good tip. So anyways, I'm going to just box select everything, hit the B key, drag it over with all these guys, B key, and one more time. There we go. And I'm going to drag these into our rock collection. Okay, so this other collection, we're just going to call scene elements. It's going to be for our camera and our lights and such. So we can collapse both of those. Now we're a bit more organized. We don't get too messy. Okay, so first thing we want to do is find which ones are our ground plane. So I'm going to turn on my handles and my my object, the gizmos and stuff, and we'll just select one of these. I'll hit the full stop key and find our first one. Okay, so this isn't a rock spire. This is actually ground. So we'll call that ground. Select another one and hit the period key, and we're going to call this one ground as well. Blender would automatically rename the other one to ground.001 just to keep things organized. So we want those two, and I'll grab this one back here as well. And there it is. So we'll call this ground. And I will jump out of rendered view. Okay, so we got ground 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to put these in their own collection. So let's shift select all those, hit new collection, and we will drag these guys down into it. There we go. And I'll call this ground. Now the ground objects have the same rock spire surface texture as all of our rock spires. Now we want to affect them differently. We want to affect the size, the texture coordinate differently for these guys. Now we could easily run into a really big problem with this, and I'll show you what that problem is. Okay, so first off, you can see we've got the number 26 next to rock spire in our materials window here, and that means there are 26 users of this material, and that is all the 26 objects that we have in the scene. If I select ground and then click this, it's going to unlink that from everything else. So now this ground is the only user of rockspire surface 001. It's created a new texture. It's an identical texture to rockspire surface, and we're going to rename this one rock ground. Okay, so now we have two materials in our scene: rockspire surface and rock ground. I'm going to select my other grounds, and I'm just going to switch them over to rock ground as well. And we're going to bring back our shader view, shader editor. Now here's where we can get into a little bit of trouble. Now, basically, this texture coordinate node, along with all the other group nodes that we've created, are linked into all of our materials, so both rockspire surface and ground. So if we make changes to ground, it's going to also make changes to all of our rock spires, which we don't want. So we actually need to clean this up a little bit and change the way we've got our setup. Now, if I jump into texture coordinate if I switch back to look dev mode, we can see everything. We'll zoom in a little bit here so you can see it a bit clearer. I'll just show you what I mean. So if I go into rock ground and I go into texture coordinate, and we can delete that one. And let's change the scale. So let's go to 1. You can see it automatically changes it on everything, which we don't want. So even though this is a new material, just undo that. Back to 0.3. So even though this is a new material, rock ground, and we could affect other things like the emission, right? Make it blue. Well, now that's only going to be affecting the ground, right? Because this has no data blocks linked to this other texture. So the problem is here in all these groups. Same with the cracks. And the cracks, of course, then have the nested texture comp. So see, we've actually created a little bit of a mess. Now, I did this not on purpose. This was an accident that I did as I was making it, but I thought I'd keep it in just because I think it's a helpful learning lesson to kind of run into. You're bound to run into this eventually yourself. As you kind of experiment and iterate and slowly progress through a project, you're going to run into problems, unexpected problems. It's really good to be able to identify those and figure out how to correct them. So we're going to correct these problems. So we're going to go to ground, and the first thing I want to do is I'm going to click on the texture coordinate, the number here, and we're going to make this its own unique user. Okay, and we're going to name this ground texture coordinate. Okay, so now if I open the drop-down menu, you can see we've got our we've got a couple different options here, and we're gonna keep our ground texture for our rock ground. Now we need to go in and change that for each of our vector, or each of our texture coordinate groups within this. So here's another one. So we're going to switch this to ground texture coordinate, and let's see, where else do we have them? Nowhere here. Up here we do. So we're going to switch to ground texture coordinate again, and then we just need to go into cracks. And actually, first what we need to do is we need to make this a fresh user. And we're going to rename this cracks ground cracks so we can find it. And we'll go inside ground cracks and we'll switch the texture coordinates in ground cracks over to ground texture coordinate, if that makes sense. So you can see this kind of mistake is not the end of the world, but it can catch you off guard. All right, so let's go ground cracks. Now you should see that this one is now updated as well because we did it in the one master ground cracks. So yep, ground cracks, and that's going to be ground texture coordinate. Yep. Any other places we're using cracks? I don't think so. Cool. All right. Okay, now the next thing we need to take care of is, well, this here, the Rockspire base image. This is the base image that's driving everything. I'm not planning on making any changes to this, so we can keep that linked to our other texture at the moment. But if we're going to make changes, then we need to look out for it. Okay, so now we can go into here and we can change this to 1. You see it's just affecting our ground, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so 1's pretty good. It's giving us some nice dense pattern with the cracks, but we're getting way too much of the glowy cell pattern. So let's jump over into the cell pattern area for the ground texture, and let's change the let's try changing the scale of this. So this is our the thing that's cutting it out, if you remember. I'll just reduce that down to like, yeah, 0.5. Oh, no, negative 0.5 look good. Now you might need to use different values because remember this is all, procedurally generated. So you might need to set it up a little bit differently to get it look right on your end. But that does the trick. We could also play around with the scale on this. We could make these much bigger. No, I think that's fine. We'll keep it kind of the same general shape. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now let's just have a look at what happens if we go to rendered mode. I'm just going to turn off my widgets again. Okay, yeah, so this is kind of bringing out the next problem, which is it's a really shiny reflectant surface. Just for the sake of speed, I'm going to drop my viewport samples down to 10, and let's Control B, and I'm just going to isolate this little area here. We're just going to work on this zone. So let's go down to the bump, and one of the things that's happened is this is a very large object, okay? Distance is an important number with a bump. So 1 represents one, I'll show you, I'll just turn this on. So 1 square on our grid, our ground plane grid. So if an object is spanning, so like this object, which spans quite a few of these, we actually need to tell it that, okay, this thing is actually pretty large. It's spanning like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 grid squares. So I'm going to actually change distance to 8. And what that's going to do is it's going to help Blender calculate the bump value and know kind of how large things are and how it should behave. So you can see the difference there. If we go back down to 0.2, it's super shiny, so there's not much bump showing up. It's because it's treating the bump as if it's sort of spread out over a really large area. But if we go all the way up to something like 8 or even 10, it's looking right. Switch down to 5. And there's always kind of a sweet spot where you can begin to see the effect. You can see as we go closer down to 0, it's getting more and more shiny. So I might keep it right at 8. Switch back to our full view. Let's have a quick look at what that did. All right, it's much better. It's no longer the mirror reflection surface that we had previously. Awesome. Now, we could tweak things all day until we're blue in the face and just keep experimenting with the modifiers and experimenting with the shaders and tweaking. And, it's a lot of fun. It's easy to get bogged down into that. I think we're just going to call it quits here with what we've got so far. And what we're going to do next time is we're going to begin to work on our lighting for our scene and our sky, I think. And we're going to start making a space sky, so creating stars and a bit of atmosphere in the horizon and creating sort of our far distance plane. And we're going to use that to really kind of help bring the scene home. We're also going to add in our sphere, and we might reposition our spires a bit just to kind of get our composition looking right. So I hope you found this tutorial really helpful and interesting. I hope that you're really enjoying this. I hope you're enjoying the process of kind of going with me in a bit more of an experimentation as we play around with the different values and play around with the overall look to kind of get something that looks cool as opposed to just having a completely scripted tutorial. Let me know if you're finding this really interesting and you're liking watching this process, like watching me make mistakes and fix them on the fly. So yeah, and I hope you're just continuing to learn and continuing to get a lot out of this. We're going to keep putting these out as regularly as possible. So if you're interested in following along, please like and subscribe, and yeah, stay tuned for what's next. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck taking your scene to the next level.